So many of the modern afflictions, the things that people suffer from, acute anxiety, fears, rages, and so on, it is not helpful to treat those through the mind. They need to be treated through the body, where they sit. So if you come to me with extreme anxiety, my first question will be, well, where is it? And you will, after a little bit of reflection, you will say to me, well, I think it's sort of here. Fine.
Really?
We know where it sits. So now let's go in and look at it.
Well, Nick, I'm interested to begin with in your chosen path because you had a pretty conventional English upbringing, if I can put it that way.
Yes.
You had a career in the army, then you went into business, and then midway through your life you decided to train as a counsellor.
Absolutely.
And a counsellor following Jungian principles?
Following Jung's principles initially, 100%. I mean, he was the inspiration, really. I found he was talking a language which I absolutely wanted to hear. And so I followed that, yes. And then I branched out from there.
Just before we get into how you branched out, is it possible to, in a nutshell, describe Jung's approach?
Yes, I would think that the most important thing that Jung did for the West, up to a point with Freud, was to rediscover the fact that we human beings have an inner life. And since the Enlightenment for the last 300-400 years, we've concentrated very, very minutely on material reality. But Jung reintroduced this idea, which the Church had really completely forgotten, that there is a dimension to life which is, he would say, unseen.
So we're talking about the imagination?
Yes, we're talking about the imagination, but Jung saw our modern crisis developing out of a failure of the imagination to relate to the unseen things of the world.
So you practiced as a Jungian psychotherapist, but then, as you say, you branched out. Now, did you branch out, or did you start to get a little frustrated with Jung's approach?
No, it wasn't that I was frustrated with Jung's approach. I was, I think, frustrated the way I had been trained, which is very common in England. It's talking therapy, that you are developing a relationship with your client, which is entirely done through talking, or very largely done through talking. And it's not that I don't think that talking is valuable, but we're missing something when we just talk. Because what we do is we talk about things. We tend not to get into the thing in itself. Mm-hmm. And that needed a different approach.
And when you say talk about, I mean, what you're also saying there is that we do much thinking about it.
Yes, because Western society, and now probably global society, is largely conducted through the thinking, discursive mind. But there are other ways of perceiving reality.
So what's wrong with thinking, then?
I think there's nothing wrong with thinking in itself, but it leaves out certain absolutely key aspects of the reality of being a human being. And it is done largely with the mind. And as you know, many other cultures consider the heart to be quite important. And we have other faculties like intuition, for example, which is not done by pure thinking. It is a perception, instant perception of absolute knowledge, a deep intuition.
And where does that rest, in your view, the power of intuition?
I think it's one of the faculties we have. I have come to think, when trying to help people, that it is really almost essential to limit the thinking mind and to help people to understand that they have within them another faculty, which I would just call pure awareness. Now, awareness is an amazing thing, because when you think about something. subject-object. I think about you, and I make all sorts of calculations about you. But when I am just aware of you, I allow you to inform me of your state, if I could put it that way. It's simply aware. It has no thinking in it. It's another faculty. It's a very beautiful faculty because it connects us to everything. Thinking, when you think about something, I, the subject, think about an object, and we have a very direct relationship with the object. When you're aware, it's a much wider perception and much less judgmental. And when that comes to mental illness and disturbance and disease, it's a tremendously important faculty. And I think we're all obsessed by thinking. I think we spend enormous amounts of time doing completely useless thinking when it goes round and round the head again, particularly if you're ill.
I was going to say, so you're thinking about disease.
I'm particularly thinking about disease. I have a disease. Immediately I'm on Google and I'm trying to think about it and how I can fix it. Whereas my approach would be to learn to become aware of what's taking place in the body, so that you have a much more direct connection with the thing that is disturbing you. I was introduced to the work of the great French scholar of Islamic thought, Henri Corbin. Corbin introduced to the West the whole profound conceptual universe behind the branch of Islam that we call Sufism, and the whole way they thought, and their whole method of perception. And this completely really changed the way I thought about things, because I suddenly saw they had a way of entering the inner world in a very, very direct world. They called it the Alam al-Mithral, and it was an intermediate world that the West simply... Christianity may have done it, but not in the way that the Sufis delineated it as a concrete spiritual universe which could be entered by the imagination.
And why did Christianity not embrace that in the way that Sufism did?
Well, they stamped it out pretty early. Really. I mean, it goes back to about the 3rd or 4th century, where Christianity, as a great magistry, an organization with councils and a great hierarchy of power, really, said there are certain things you can believe and certain things you can't believe. Whereas the Sufi way was much closer to the Platonic idea of an unfolding and of paying attention to actually what was happening through you. And, of course, what was happening through you was communicated by images.
So could you unpick that for me a little bit and give me an example, then, of the sort of thing that the Sufis would do and use in order to get into that realm?
I mean, the Sufis, the greatest presence of God was the presence of beauty. And for them, beauty was a theophany, the presence of God. It's an act of imagination available to every human being if they are interested or can be bothered. But it's not how we're educated, so we think, oh, the imagination. Well, that's just imaginary. That's Walt Disney. It's advertising for 4X lager or whatever it may be. That's imagination because it's not real. But for the Sufis, the imagination, which is our capacity to create images, was the presence of the Creator in the world.
So how do you then take what Corbin gave you and apply it to what you do when it comes to dealing with people, particularly who have a disease or serious mental problem? I
came to really emphasize the inner dimension of the problem. And by inner dimension, which itself can sound a bit sort of, what does that mean? I mean that you go inside. Because until you go inside, and by that I mean literally you close your eyes and I take you inside, it's difficult to meet that dimension of yourself. Dreams are a very obvious answer, that dreams are full of figures. Certain types of dreams, they're influenced by the day's events, but not the big dreams. And not the really... You see, it depends where you put your attention. If your attention is entirely focused on the external world and you're only interested in surviving, which of course is a reality for many, many, many people, then you're going to mostly deal with the external world. But if you allow yourself a measure of reflection and a measure of turning inwards, you begin to meet these other areas of the personality, which are peopled with images. I mean, to give you a very, very simple example, if I asked you to close your eyes and I said, okay, Ian, just imagine a house. What's going to happen is you're going to imagine a house. You don't know which house you're going to imagine. It'll just pop up.
Yeah.
Now, that particular house is filled with information for me, because it may tell me you just imagine your parents' house. Well, there's an element of you that never left home. There's still a childish bit is stuck at home. Or you may envision a house that you don't yet own. Well, that may be an aspiration, something you're working towards, you long for. There's some longing there. But anyway, it's full of information. That's just one simple image. But your inner world is peopled with images of the great archetypal images of the child, the mother, the father, the old wise man, and so on. These are hugely formative for the personality. They're going on underneath us, whether we pay attention or whether we don't. The Sufis largely taught me that, and they taught me to take that world seriously. So these images that arise in dreams, in visualizations, which I almost entirely concentrate on working with people, are coming from, we're not just quite exactly sure where.
But you don't sit down with somebody and get them to tell you their dreams alone. It's a much more active process that you're engaged in when you're dealing with a client, is it?
Well, it was. I think I've changed tremendously, because what I feel I can help people to do is to look at themselves, that I can introduce people to themselves, let them make their own minds up. I'm not selling anything. No, I'm just trying to say, look what's happening inside you. Because you see, we now live in a secular society. We've decided that maybe that was a good way to be peaceful, and it doesn't seem to be going too well. But anyway, that was where we went. We thought, let's take religion out of all this. Well, I'm all for that, because I'm not sure religion is actually terribly helpful. But I think we chucked the baby out with the bathwater, because I think we chucked out a whole universe, which one could broadly call the spiritual universe. And I think the next generation know that. I don't think they're bothered. I don't think they're going to go to church. But I think they're tremendously interested in what a muddle we've all got into, and how do we get out of this individually and as a culture. And what this tradition does, it puts you directly in touch with a living mystery, which is what the churches should have done, but got lost on the way. And so I like to put people into their living mystery on day one and take them inside and look at the images that arise in them. And so if it's of a disease, I want to help them to see an image of that disease. I want them to look at that disease, put them directly in relationship to it. Because once you're in relationship to it, rather than thinking about it, you become aware of its texture and its feeling and what's going on in the system. And then you can begin to respond.
Can you give me a specific example then of somebody that you've dealt with who you did that with? I mean, the actual process that you go through with an individual.
Absolutely. I mean, typically, my clients would come from doctors. So they would come with a clean bill of health, and we would know there was nothing physically wrong with them. But the particular case I'm thinking of was where a middle-aged man of 55 had been a very successful businessman, but he'd increasingly become overtaken by a total lassitude until he couldn't really get out of bed in the morning. All his motivational efforts, he had none. He couldn't get hold of anything. His life didn't mean anything. I saw him 3 times. And I think on the second occasion, I took him in and introduced him to an aspect of himself which we could broadly just call the child, which is a very, very powerful archetype. I mean, it's no accident that the Christian tradition has at its center the child in the middle of the drama. But we all have that. Each one of us has that drama inside us. And I make it sound too easy, but I put him in touch with that, and something absolutely, completely, radically changed. He learnt to develop a relationship with that part of himself which was completely bombed out. And new energy flooded in because the child has that energy, has new life, creativity. That is the child is the future. I'm talking about an archetype, really, but some people might not know what an archetype is. It's a sort of, it's a form in us, and it actually comes as an image. So you can imagine your 6 or 8-year-old self, and it's charged with energy. Jung called these images of transformation, because these images hold an energy which is available to us if we will but contemplate it and rest with it and allow. We're so arrogant, we think we can manage all this, but this stuff informs us.
Mm-hmm. So in that particular example, how did he go forward into the rest of his life? Did he take this child with him consciously?
Yes, the child for him was a whole chunk of his life he'd left behind, which he'd had to leave behind in order to survive. But there was an enormous amount of energy bound up now, so he cut himself off from that energy. So we reconnected with that energy, it flooded back into personality, and he was basically fine. He no longer had to spend day in bed. He went back to the office. He was fine. He was quite cheerful.
Really? Really?
And so it's a very, very beautiful example of how powerful these images are. And, this is not new. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the great British Field Marshal Lord Slim, who had fought the Japanese war in Burma, when asked who was the finest fighting soldier in the world, everybody just assumed he was going to say the British. And he said the Japanese. And I said, why? He said, I tell you why. The Japanese infantryman goes into battle with his grandfather on his right shoulder, his grandmother on his left shoulder, and he will die rather than let them down. Now that is the power of images. Mm. That is how the image can affect us. And we in the West think it's imaginary. It's not real. We're nuts, basically. It's incredibly powerful in all of us. We just don't know it. So my way of working is to help turn people towards these images and then let them see if that image catches them. And some may need 2 or 3 goes to help them. And very rarely do people say, well, it means nothing. And it's a dimension of life that is, I think, missing from Western culture, very, very badly needed back.
So that's a sort of psychological issue that you've been dealing with in a sense. But of course, what you've more recently found that you're dealing with is physical disease. And serious physical disease as well. Now, one imagines if you get a serious physical disease, cancer being perhaps the big one that everyone fears, there's really nothing the imagination can do about that because it's a physical disease and it's either treatable by modern medicine or it's going to get you. But I get the impression that you don't quite...
Well, let me first of all say I'm not in competition with the medical profession. Anything I do is an addition to, really. I'm not challenging that. But the mind and the body are really a single continuum. They're a single thing. Now, we become great specialists in the West at treating the body. Brilliant. I mean, you simply can't. Miracles. But the mind is always involved. And it's like an echo. Because it's a single thing, it's almost like you can't have a disease without there being an echo somewhere in the mind. And if I could just say, in this country, at the last count, we have 108 autoimmune diseases. These vast things of MEMS, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's disease, Graves' disease, all these sort of things, which I'm not necessarily sure the previous generation would ever have about, but here they all are. 108. Now, when you look at those, you look them up, the vast majority of them are termed idiopathic, which means, quite simply, we don't have a clue how these diseases develop. And talk to any of the top oncologists in London, which I have done, we don't really know how it arises. We become hugely good at dealing with the things. We sort of bring in the B-52 bombers and we can flatten the the tumours or whatever. We don't quite know how it forms. Now, I find that completely astonishing in an advanced civilization, because it suggests to me 108 autoimmune diseases, we don't know where they come from, that we're looking in the wrong place. Because we're largely looking at the behavior of material matter. We are not looking at the energy, the feelings, the emotions of the mind behind these diseases. Now, I'm not for one single second saying I know how to cure cancer. But in the cases I have worked with, there is no doubt about it. You can put people into a completely different relationship to their disease because they can actually see the tumour by visualizing it, and there they are, it's theirs. They're not listening to somebody or seeing images on a screen or something, it's theirs, there they are. And that is awareness, that is becoming aware that the body is turbulent in some way and something is happening. And all I can really say is there is, without question, meaning in that exercise.
Could you give me an absolute example then of somebody that you've worked with?
Yes, we're going to talk about a cancer case later on, so I'll give you a case that is not cancerous. This is just a quite common but hideous affliction called fibromyalgia. Now, fibromyalgia is a beastly thing. You get inflammation in the spine, you get inflammation in the joints, you get this huge lassitude and this tremendous exhaustion. And I had a client who dragged this around for 17 years and taken endless pills and things didn't really help. But we got at it actually largely through repetitive breathing exercises. And he'd had it for 17 years, and we lifted the whole thing in 5 months. And it's never come back. Because behind this disease were two things. There was this unbelievably tight energy of pushing himself. For a whole host of reasons for his family, he'd been pushing himself to succeed. Nothing wrong with that. But at some point, as the wonderful Hungarian Dr. Gabor Mate says, the body says no. And the body just couldn't take any more of it. But the other image that went with that disease was of the little boy, almost dead, dying inside him.
And he discovered that?
I took him in a visualization, and we discovered this child in bed, really at the point of death. So he had to look after that part of himself, whatever he conceived the child being. It's his child, not mine.
Yeah. So Nick, just take me back. When you were in that process, taking him inside, did he come across his child, and was it a surprise to him to find the child?
Absolute, total and
he
complete
didn't make it up, as it were.
No. But the imagination is an incredible tool. Because I can say to you, imagine a child, and you will. But you won't necessarily chosen which child you imagine or what age he's going to be. So if I guide people inside themselves in a case like that, we go to look for the child and we will find it. But nobody is constructing the child to be half dead when we find it. Mm. That is the psyche producing this extraordinary image which reflects his state.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of sobering things I think I've come to understand is the image, and this is an image of a child. So the real child's not there, it's like an image of a child, but it's more real than real, it's incredibly powerful. The image bears witness to your state.
And that's a Sufi thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then when, in that particular example, when you discovered this child, what did you get him to do?
I didn't get him to do anything. He sat in my consulting room with his eyes closed, sitting beside the bed in which the child was dying, holding the child's hand until the child opened his eyes. Now, that was fine. So he'd made a connection with himself, profound connection with himself. He was very moved by it, because he was looking at his crippled self. I mean, he had a thing called fibromyalgia, but actually he was inside crippled and exhausted. But we then needed to shift it in the body, because it was actually in the body. It was in the, he showed me the X-ray scans, it was information down the spine and so on. And we did that by simply I make him up a little audio clip with deep relaxation and breathing exercises. But he intuited very early on, this guy, that this gave him some relief, which all the medication he'd had hadn't given him relief at all. But he sort of felt, oh, that's just, okay, that's right. After about 5 months, this dense condition that had been there for 17 years started to lift. And I remember saying to him, how often have you used my audio clip? And he said, 300 or 400 times. So he understood. And this is one of the big difficulties. Much easier to take a pill. The only problem is the pill didn't work. Whereas he knew he was learning to unwind himself. And coupled with the image of the child he was learning to look after, the whole condition lifted.
One imagines, though, that his doctor would have been a little bit cynical of this miracle cure. What was the reaction, if you know it, to...
Well, the answer is I don't know. Some doctors are enormously open-minded about this, but they have their own belief. They're trained in a particular belief. I'm trained in a different sort of angle. And both, I think, are necessary. I'm not, as I keep saying, I'm not in competition in any way at all. It's up for individuals to work this out. So, I wouldn't dream of saying to a cancer client, well, you shouldn't have chemotherapy. But what I would say is, if you're going to do chemotherapy, make sure that you work with yourself, with your own deep energy and feelings, because that is so much, to my way of thinking, so much part of the disease.
Hi, Ian.
Jansha, hello.
So sorry about that.
So, if you're ready to roll...
I'm ready when I'm...
Well, hi, Jansha. Thank you very much for talking to me. I spent quite a bit of time talking to Nick about his work and how he operates. And then he told me, frankly, this extraordinary story about how you work together. I really just wanted you to give your side of the story, really. I've heard it from Nick, and it's a pretty extraordinary story in his telling. Could you first of all tell me about the cancer that you've suffered from?
So, in February of 2022, I was diagnosed with a rare form of liver cancer called fibrolamellar hepatocellular carcinoma. I was 19 years old when I was diagnosed. At the time of my diagnosis, I was told by my medical team that there were absolutely no treatments whatsoever, and that the main, treatment for the cancer was surgery. And the surgeons were telling me that they would have to continuously cut the cancer and take it out, and that the recurrence rate of the cancer is 95%. So the cancer is extremely rare. It's found in 1 in 5 million people in the world. So just for a number, I think there's only around 300 documented patients around the world with my cancer. So that is very rare and extremely aggressive.
I've been talking to Jansha, whom you know well, and he's told me his side of the story.
It's an extraordinary story, really, because I was asked if I would help a young man in New York who had one of the most hideous cancers in the world, called fibrolamellar cancer of the liver. And I was asked to do that because his mother's great friend in England I had worked with, and I'd worked with in this particular way, and we'd been quite successful together, and we'd helped her with her condition. And she said, well, can't you help this boy in New York? And I said, look, I don't know anything about cancer. How can I possibly help? And anyway, he's in New York, I'm in London. So I said, okay, look, I'll tell you what, let's have one session online for Jansh to tell me about his disease. Let me get a feel of it, for the background to it, the emotional background, the energetic background, see what we can do. Now, Jansha had been on chemotherapy for 4 months.
Because this is a voracious form of cancer.
This is a killer, and it's a killer of young people, particularly. It's very hard to cure, and it nearly always comes back. But they were insistent, and I talked to the mother, and I said, look, you have to understand, this is so experimental, and I don't really know what I'm doing. And she said, well, I'm not sure anybody else knows, so you know. So if you can help me save my boy, please, please, please help. So I thought, well, at least we can have a conversation. So this lovely young man comes on screen, and I can't find anything really I can't find what I would call the warning signs of early distress. You know, he did badly at school and he got stuff going on in the body. He was incredibly fit, wonderfully good-looking guy, really cheerful and lovely. He just happens to have a killer disease going on inside him.
I was very tired all the time, very sick. I had one rather large tumor in the right side of my liver, and then a smaller one closer towards the middle. And then I had another quite large tumor outside my liver, touching the pancreas. Now, at the time I spoke with Nick, I'd been undergoing intense chemotherapy. I'd been hospitalized for a month. I lost about 20 kilograms. So I lost a lot of weight and I got really, really, really sick.
So very early on in the process, I take him into a visualization of his liver. And this we can do with a little bit of practice. We just learn to go inside, close our eyes, become aware, use this faculty of awareness to discover what's going on inside us. And the awareness is just such an extraordinary thing. It'll tell you. It's like if you trust it, it'll stay with it, and he eventually gets an image of the liver. But he then goes all quiet, and he says to me, Nick, this is so weird. What's weird? He said, well, what I am looking at, I can see the outline of the liver, but embedded in the liver is a Second World War ship's mine.
He was just so intrigued by this. And I told him this image has been stuck with me for a very long time. It's just always been in the back of my head. I never really thought about it, never said about anything about it. And then when he asked me to approach it, I was like, I can't. I was like, you can't? And it's like, it's your imagination. You think you can do whatever you want in your imagination. But I told him, I was like, I cannot touch this mind. It's spiking hot. I can't touch it. It scares me. I don't want to touch it.
Now, for a young man contemplating himself to say that is a pretty strong statement. I mean, what's he looking at? Now, we were lucky in that I ended the first session and I saw him the next day and he dreamt about the mine. And in his dream, the mine was washed up and had a crack in it. So we went into the crack.
And then what happened?
And then all hell was let loose, really. This energy just flooded through his body. And I just kept telling him to accept it. Just accept it, accept it, accept it. To me, this is the thing we really have to do when we're really in trouble. We have to accept this stuff.
All this fire and all this energy inside, he said, I want you to put it into your right hand. And I was very weak at the time still. But I just remember, all this energy in my hand, I couldn't stop my hand from shaking. And each session he was like, I want you to punch a pillow, or I want you to, it's like, whatever it is, let it out some way. So I remember I would go to the football pitch, I would smash a ball against the net as hard as I can, because it was just like a release for me, because I just felt all this energy was built up inside me.
First of all, it rushed to his head, and he said, I've got stars going off in my head and all this sort of stuff. And then it rushed down into his arm, and he said, my arm is going to catch fire. And so I made him ball his fist and tried to discharge it. That's what I wanted. I wanted the energy out. And he did it out and then collapsed back onto the bed. Now, he knew and I knew we'd done something. We didn't know what we'd done, but we were sure as anything we had done something.
As far as you were concerned, as you were watching this screen, what were you watching happening on the screen when that energy was released?
Well, a young man thrashing around in bed.
Really?
And after that moment, his energy about his disease just completely changed. His mother said to me, he's become a warrior. He doesn't think he's got cancer. And he'd been in treatment for 4 months, and the situation was stabilized. Maybe it was the chemotherapy, I don't know, but the tumor markers started falling, and eventually he developed necrosis in all the tumors, and the stuff died. The cancer was out. He had to have a hideous operation to take the tumors because they were quite big out. But he came to see me in London the other day. He's fine.
Nick was very well versed in, Indian traditions, Chinese traditions, and he told me that in Chinese tradition, the liver was the organ of rage. And I don't think it was just a coincidence that, I see a ball of fire and the Chinese tradition refers to the liver as the organ of rage. What I thought was really fascinating was Nick would always tell me to say "I love you" to this ball of fire, and I just was very perplexed by it. But because it was almost like, why would I say "I love you" to something that's actually trying to kill me? He wanted me to embrace the cancer as opposed to try to destroy it or do anything like that. But as we did these sessions, I just became so calm with the idea of having cancer. I felt so relaxed about everything. It wasn't like, oh my God, I have cancer, I have to stress about it. It was just like, everything's going to be okay. I know I'll be fine.
I think, and what has repeated itself a number of times, is when you put people in touch with their disease directly, it's not just an idea which you just say cancer to somebody, they immediately start going, ugh. But actually, when they're in relationship to their disease, something seems to change. Somehow it's like they're center stage again, somehow not in charge, but they're in relationship to what's going on their body. Because we don't know how cancer tumours form. So why can we not be interested in the energy and the emotion behind it?
As you look back on that period of time then, how do you view the fact that the tumours died? I mean, what part did Nick's psychotherapy play on your recovery?
What I found amazing about all this is that the tumours I saw, because I have photos of when the tumours were taken out, they were exactly how I imagined them. Do I think the treatment contributed to the death of my tumours? This treatment that they did on me, it didn't work for several other kids who've had this treatment, This was a completely experimental treatment. Could it just be a coincidence that it worked on me? Yes. But I do think that releasing that fire, releasing all that energy, and specifically for the tumour in the liver, because it was a tumour in the liver that was completely dead. It was just completely necrotic. And I think our main focus was the tumour in the liver. All that work that we put into it, I definitely think there was a contribution towards the death of the cancer.
I had another interesting case some time ago where we did a visualization on a woman who was dying and of cancer. There's nothing I could do to help her, but we were trying to sort out other issues. And she did a visualization on her cancer in the lung, and it was like a rod going through her lung. And I said to her, well, can you tell me what the rod is made of? And she went very, very quiet. And then she said, repressed fury. So where we repress emotions, we have no experience of the rage in us. It sounds odd, but we can do that. We have that capacity. It'll play havoc with the body in later life.
So all of these experiences, what does it teach you about your approach and about what you gain from the Sufi tradition?
I think our wonderful, clever civilization has lost touch with the dimension of what it is to be a human being. And that dimension is hugely difficult for modern science, because if I say it is the unseen dimension, they all say, oh, yeah, sure, big deal. What does that mean? But it is. It's an unseen mystery, in a sense, deep in ourselves. And we've sort of poo-pooed it and said, well, we just, look through more mice scrapes, we'll find it. And we haven't. And we're now riddled with these diseases, these autoimmune diseases of endless variety coming out, and allergies and all this stuff pouring over the place, and mental health epidemics and all the rest of it, which we can't actually cure with pills.
Doesn't sound to me as if many psychotherapists, though, use this approach. So, could the profession itself learn a great deal from what you've been doing?
I wouldn't dream of telling the profession what it should do. However, I would say this, that the vast therapeutic endeavour is done through the thinking mind, through talking. And I simply find there's nothing wrong with talking. Of course, in fact, in the early stages of the case, it can be very important for somebody to unburden themselves. But for me, it isn't going to the heart of the matter. Because as I said before, we're talking about something. We're talking about my disease, or my feelings, or my despair, or my whatever. We're not actually going into the despair itself and accepting it. I mean, this is, I think, the great lesson we learn. We need to accept so much of what happens to us. I don't mean we're just passive, sort of, because this is a very positive and a very active approach to what goes wrong in your body or your mind. It's just becoming a little bit more humble. I think we become terribly, terribly arrogant that we can fix anything. And clearly what's happening is we can't.
And I suppose the sort of Western 21st century culture that we live in puts a great spotlight on each and every one of us to do as good as we can possibly do. We have to be perfectionists.
I think this is so true, Ian, and it's not that I want to stop people being perfect at what they do.
But there's a danger there.
But there's a huge danger here, because the fact is we are composed of opposite tendencies. So, for example, if you're very ambitious on one side of your nature, you may be absolutely certain that on the other side of your nature there's going to be a terror of failure. And if you're very optimistic over here, you're going to be sure that hidden, maybe, there will be a deep pessimism. I mean, the saying I always use is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Because you can have good intentions here, and the West needs to listen to this very carefully, because we can have the best intentions, we really think we're good guys. But on the other side of the personality, on what I call the shadow side of the personality, there are all the negative qualities we're seeing in other people.
And what do you do with that shadow side?
Make you conscious of it. Make you conscious that you have these hideous things in yourself. And if you're not conscious of them, you'll be super active seeing them in other people.
But being conscious of them is one thing, but presumably you have to somehow work with them, do you?
Exactly that. That's where the image comes in. You need an image of what that negative side of your personality looks like, because you say, gosh, he looks pretty unhappy. Right, you've got an image. Now stop being so beastly to him. Start being nice to him. See how he reacts. Oh, he just seems to be a bit happier. Okay, well, we've done a little something. Do you see what I mean?
So it's working in that realm.
It's always working in that realm, and really working in that realm with love and acceptance, rather than technological excellence. It's like treating that part of yourself, which is formed for all sorts of reasons, the broken part of yourself, the sad, the unhappy part of yourself, the unfulfilled side of yourself, and learning to welcome it and integrate it into the whole personality. And this is where I think religion has been terrible. It's like we moralize this. You say, you can't be angry. But maybe you're angry for a reason, and maybe you need to modify that anger so you can join the family of yourself and be part of your power. So I see this as a work of integration, yes, and completeness. We've got everything in us, you know, it's all there. We just have to become conscious of it.